He knew the investigators by their first names. He knew which detectives took their coffee black and which ones kept candy in the top drawer of their desk. He knew the layout of the building well enough that he could walk from the front entrance to the records annex without stopping to check the signs on the doors. For 4 years, between 1982 and 1986, Dennis Calloway showed up at the Garfield Township Police Department every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, signed the volunteer log in the front office, and spent several hours filing case documents, answering phones, and generally making himself useful in a police department that, like most small city departments in early 1980s New York, was perpetually understaffed and grateful for the help. He was punctual. He was cheerful. He was, by the unanimous account of everyone who worked alongside him, a genuinely pleasant man to have around. What the Garfield Township Police Department did not know, what no one would know for 43 years, was that one of the cases in the filing room that Dennis Calloway handled regularly, the one in the green hanging folder labeled Alderton, Carroll, homicide, 1980, was the case he had a very specific reason to keep close. That is not a story about a volunteer. That is a story about a man who spent 4 years inside the investigation that should have ended with his arrest, and about the forensic breakthrough that named him 4 decades after he walked out of that police station for the last time. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to the fall of 1980. Because to understand what was done to Carol Alderton, you first have to understand who she was. Garfield Township sat in the mid-Hudson Valley of New York, roughly 60 miles north of the city, in the kind of county that felt entirely different from the metropolis it was technically adjacent to. In 1980, it had a population of around 17,000 distributed across a main street corridor, 3 church steeples visible from the railroad overpass, and the particular rhythms of a working-class river town that had lost most of its manufacturing base in the 1970s and was still figuring out what came next. People worked at the hospital, at the county government offices, at the few remaining machine shops along the river. They watched the Yankees on television and got their news from the Poughkeepsie Journal and, for local matters, from the Garfield Township Courier, which came out every Wednesday. In the fall of 1980, the biggest story in the Courier was a proposed extension of the municipal water main to the outlying neighborhoods. Life was ordinary in the specific way that lives in small working-class cities are ordinary. Not glamorous, not especially troubled, just the steady accumulation of days. Carol Alderton was 26 years old and an administrative coordinator at the Garfield Township Hospital, where she had worked for 3 years after completing her degree in health administration at the community college in Poughkeepsie. She was the oldest of 4 children. Her parents, Frank and Elaine Alderton, lived 6 blocks from the apartment Carol rented on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian on Maple Street. And she was known at the hospital for a combination of organizational precision and personal warmth that her supervisor, a man named Gerald Hoyt, told investigators was genuinely rare. She could manage 4 competing priorities simultaneously and still remember to ask how your mother was feeling. She had a habit of keeping a small notepad in her cardigan pocket for things she needed to remember, and her colleagues said you could always tell when something was genuinely important to her because she would write it on the notepad instead of trusting herself to recall it later. She had been saving for a trip to Ireland, where her grandmother had been born. She had a jar on her kitchen counter where she put the change from every transaction, and according to her sister Maureen, the jar was about a third full by October of 1980. October 11th, 1980 was a Saturday. Carol had worked a half shift that morning. The hospital ran skeleton weekend staff and had left at noon. Her plan for the afternoon was documented in her notepad, which was recovered during the investigation. Pick up dry cleaning, Call Maureen. Look at the winter coat at Harrington's department store that she had been considering for 2 weeks. She was seen on Maple Street at approximately 1:15 in the afternoon by a neighbor, Mrs. Virginia Polk, who waved at Carol from her first-floor window and later told police that Carol had waved back and kept walking, seemingly fine, seemingly in no hurry. Mrs. Polk was the last person who could confirm she had seen Carol Alderton alive. Carol did not come to Sunday dinner at her parents' house the following day. That was not like her. She had not missed a Sunday dinner since she had moved into the apartment on Maple Street 18 months earlier. When her mother Elaine called the apartment and received no answer, she asked Frank to drive over. Frank Alderton let himself in with the spare key Carol had given her parents and found the apartment empty, tidy, and entirely ordinary, except that Carol's purse was on the kitchen table, her dry cleaning was not, and the notepad from her cardigan pocket was lying on the floor near the door as if it had fallen from a pocket or been dropped in a hurry. He called the police at 1:47 on Sunday afternoon. He did not wait to be told she had probably just gone somewhere for the night. He knew his daughter. She would have called. The Garfield Township Police Department assigned the case to Detective Sergeant Arthur Binns, a 22-year veteran of the department who was known among his colleagues as someone who could conduct an investigation with the patience of a man who did not believe in shortcuts and the stubbornness of a man who did not believe in giving up. He was 51 years old, 2 years from the retirement he would eventually take and immediately regret, and he approached the Alderton case with the full attention he gave everything that crossed his desk. The physical evidence gathered in the first 72 hours was thin by the standards of what an investigation needs. Carol's purse, wallet intact, keys inside, established that whatever had happened had not been a robbery. The notepad, which had fallen near the door, was dusted for prints. It showed Carol's own prints and one partial unidentified print on the back cover that was logged but could not be matched to anyone in the department's system. A door-to-door canvass of the immediate neighborhood produced 11 interviews. One neighbor, a retired postal worker named Howard Greer, reported having heard what he described as a sound like something falling from the direction of the Maple Street building between 1:30 and 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, though he could not be more precise. That detail was entered into the case record and would sit there for 39 years. Carol's body was found on October 17, 1980, 6 days after she was last seen, by a maintenance crew working along a state utility easement approximately 3 miles outside of the township limits. The medical examiner determined cause of death as asphyxiation and established that she had died within hours of her disappearance on October 11th. Physical evidence recovered at the discovery site was collected, catalogued, and preserved by Detective Binns with the same methodical care he applied to everything. He would tell colleagues, more than once in the years that followed, that he preserved that evidence the way you preserve something you intend to come back to. In the course of the investigation, 2 men attracted serious attention. The first was a former co-worker of Carol's at the hospital who had been terminated the previous spring under circumstances that had been contentious, and who had, according to 2 separate colleagues, made comments about Carol that people had found uncomfortable at the time and remembered clearly in the context of her death. He was interviewed twice. His whereabouts on October 11th were verified through parking lot security records and a store receipt time-stamped at 2:40 in the afternoon after Howard Greer's account of the sound from the building. He was cleared. The second was a man whose name was never publicly released, a resident of the building adjacent to Carol's, who had a history of civil disputes with neighbors, and whose demeanor during the interview Detective Binns found concerning in a way he couldn't quantify. He was cleared through physical evidence comparison. His name remained in the file. 2 years passed. Then a man named Dennis Calloway walked through the front door of the Garfield Township Police Department in the fall of 1982 and offered to volunteer. Dennis Calloway was 38 years old at the time, a laid-off machine shop worker who had been out of steady employment for nearly a year, and who presented himself as someone looking for ways to contribute to the community while he figured out his next steps professionally. He was average in height, unremarkable in appearance, calm in conversation, and genuinely helpful in the ways that matter most to an understaffed department. Reliable, quiet, competent with administrative tasks, thorough with filing. He was given access to the non-restricted records area, which included the active and recent cold case files, as a matter of routine practice for volunteers handling administrative work. This was not unusual. Departments across New York ran volunteer programs with similar access structures throughout the 1980s, and there was no systematic protocol requiring that volunteer applicants be cross-referenced against ongoing homicide investigations. There was no reason to build such a protocol. Until there was. He filed. He answered phones. He sat at a spare desk on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons for 4 years, and made himself so ordinary and so useful that no one thought twice about his presence. The officers who worked with him remembered him, when asked decades later, as someone who was simply there, not memorable, not uncomfortable, just present and dependable in the background of a department that needed people to be present and dependable in the background. He left voluntarily in 1986. He said he had found new employment and couldn't keep the schedule. He thanked the front desk sergeant. He was thanked in return. He walked out of the department and moved to a town 30 miles north, and the Garfield Township Police Department continued without him, and no one made any connection between Dennis Calloway and Carol Alderton, because there had been no reason to make one. That absence of reason had kept him safe for nearly 40 years. By 1990, 10 years had passed since Carol Alderton disappeared on a Saturday afternoon with a notepad in her cardigan pocket and plans for the rest of the day. Her parents held a private memorial every October 11th. Her sister Maureen, who had moved to Albany, drove back for it every year without exception. The dry cleaning Carol had gone out to pick up that afternoon was never recovered. The winter coat at Harrington's department store, the one she had been considering for 2 weeks, was purchased by someone else. The jar of change that Carol had been filling for her trip to Ireland sat on a shelf in Elaine Alderton's kitchen, where Elaine had placed it after packing up Carol's apartment in the spring of 1981. She never moved it. It was still there in 1995. It was still there in 2000. It was still there the morning Detective Reyes called. Detective Arthur Binns retired in 1982. He had carried the Alderton file home in his head for 2 years before he left, and continued carrying it for years after. He kept a personal notebook, separate from the official case file, where he wrote the details he couldn't stop turning over. The partial print on the notepad back cover, the sound Howard Greer had heard, the specific window between 1:15 and 2 o'clock on October 11th that no one had been able to account for. He had never been able to place anyone inside that window. He updated the notebook when new forensic technology was mentioned in the law enforcement publications. He continued to read well into retirement. When he read about DNA genealogy matching in the mid-2000s, he wrote a single line at the bottom of a page. Evidence was preserved. Someone needs to submit it. He died in 2018 at the age of 89. The notebook was found in the top drawer of his home office desk by his son, who recognized the case name and contacted the Garfield Township Department. Frank Alderton died in 2005. Elaine lived until 2014, long enough to know that the case had been re-examined, but not long enough to know what the examination would eventually find. She had, in her final years, stopped asking the department for updates, not because she had stopped caring, but because she had run out of ways to ask. Maureen kept asking for her. By 2010, 30 years had passed. Maureen Alderton, now 54 years old, had begun making formal written requests to the Garfield Township Police Department to have her sister's case reviewed under updated forensic protocols. She cited specific publications. She cited case precedents from other jurisdictions where cold case submissions had produced results decades after the original crime. She cited the evidence preservation log that Detective Binns had maintained, which she had obtained a copy of through a public records request, and she asked, in careful, measured language, why no one had submitted it. The department assigned the case to Detective Claudia Reyes, who had joined the force in 2006 and had a particular interest in evidence-based cold case methodology. She pulled the Alderton file in 2013. She read every page. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, take a second to like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Carol. Detective Reyes found what Binns had left her, a chain of custody documentation that was, by any standard of evidence preservation, exceptional. Every item from the 1980 collection was accounted for. The biological evidence from the recovery site had been maintained in sealed archival conditions through 2 facility upgrades. The partial print from the notepad back cover had been rephotographed in high resolution during a 2001 equipment update. She submitted the biological evidence for DNA profiling and CODIS comparison in the spring of 2014. CODIS returned no match. The person responsible had no prior criminal conviction requiring DNA collection. Detective Reyes renewed the submission in 2019 using an updated protocol that included comparison against the major consumer genetic genealogy databases, the same services that millions of Americans use to trace their family histories. The process, explained in plain language, works by identifying partial DNA matches to relatives of the unknown contributor, and then mapping those matches through family tree records until they converge on a single individual. The laboratory result came back in the spring of 2021. The DNA profile from the Alderton recovery site matched at a level indicating a close familial relationship to a cluster of individuals in the genealogy database, with roots in mid-Hudson Valley, New York. The forensic genealogist working the case traced the family tree through 3 generations and arrived at a name, Dennis Calloway. Detective Reyes pulled the volunteer logs. She found his name on 41 entries over 4 years. She found it on the specific volunteer check-in sheet dated to the period when the Carol Alderton file, the green hanging folder, Alderton, Carol, Homicide, 1980, had been processed through the filing rotation. She requested the original records from the 1982 intake of Dennis Calloway as a volunteer, which included a brief personal information form he had filled out at the time, listing his previous address. His previous address in 1982 was on Garfield Street, 4 blocks from Carol's apartment on Maple Street. She pulled the vehicle registration records from the original 1980 investigation. In 1980, Dennis Calloway had been registered as the owner of a sedan whose make and model were consistent with tire impressions found at the utility easement recovery site. Impressions that Detective Binns had documented carefully in 1980 and that the case file contained in precise detail. The impression width, the tread pattern classification, the turning radius indicated by the entry and exit marks. All of it was in Binns's notes. All of it was consistent with Calloway's registered vehicle. There was one more thing. In the course of cross-referencing the partial fingerprint from the notepad back cover, rephotographed in high resolution in 2001 against Calloway's fingerprint record obtained as part of the current investigation, the State Forensic Lab returned a result. The partial print from the notepad that Carol Alderton had kept in her cardigan pocket, the print that had been logged in 1980 and sat unmatched for 39 years, was consistent with Dennis Calloway's left index finger. He had touched her notepad. Dennis Calloway was 77 years old when Detective Reyes drove to his home in the fall of 2021. He was living in a house outside of Rhinebeck, New York, with a small garden along the front walk and a truck in the driveway. He answered the door and looked at her badge and said nothing for a long moment. He had been, by all accounts of people who knew him in his later years, a quiet man. He went inside without being asked. Detective Reyes followed. He was arrested that morning on charges of second-degree murder. The Garfield County District Attorney's Office filed the formal charges in October 2021. Dennis Calloway entered a not guilty plea. In February 2023, facing the DNA evidence, the fingerprint comparison, the vehicle registration records, and the geographic placement evidence, he changed his plea to guilty of manslaughter in the first degree. He was sentenced in May 2023 to 8 to 24 years in state prison. He was 79 years old at sentencing. The community of Garfield Township received the news with the particular reaction that only a case like this one produces. A reaction that goes beyond relief because it has to incorporate 41 years of knowing the case was unsolved. 4 years of a perpetrator having sat inside the police station handling the case file, and the knowledge that it had taken a genealogy database and a detective who read every page of a 40-year-old file to get there. At least one former colleague who had volunteered alongside Calloway in the 1980s told a reporter they had thought of him occasionally over the years and had assumed he was probably a perfectly ordinary man living a perfectly ordinary life somewhere. That assumption turned out to be correct in a way they had not anticipated. Maureen Alderton had been writing letters to the police department for over 20 years. She had driven from Albany every October 11th for 4 decades. She was 66 years old when Detective Reyes called her in the fall of 2021. She said, in a statement released through her attorney the following day, that she had stopped allowing herself to imagine what the call would feel like because imagining it had started to feel like tempting fate. She said that Carol had deserved better than 43 years. She said that the detective who read the file and the detective who had preserved the evidence both had her family's gratitude, and that she hoped Arthur Binns, who had died in 2018, had somehow known it was coming. Carol Alderton had a notepad in her cardigan pocket. She had plans for the afternoon. She was saving change in a jar for a trip to Ireland. She was 26 years old, and she had done nothing at all, that should have ended on an October afternoon in 1980 on a utility easement 3 miles outside of town. Her family never stopped believing she was owed the truth. A retired detective wrote in his personal notebook that the evidence had been preserved and someone needed to submit it. A sister wrote letters for 20 years, and a detective who joined the force 26 years after the crime read every page of a file and found what 40 years of waiting had made available: a partial print on a notepad back cover, a DNA match traced through a family tree, and a man who had spent 4 years inside the investigation filing papers in a green hanging folder with his victim's name on it. Justice came for Carol Alderton after 43 years. She was 26 years old. The jar is still on the shelf. There are questions this case demands. What does it say about a person that their strategy for concealment was to place themselves inside the investigation, to answer the phones, file the folders, know the investigators by name, and that this strategy worked for 4 years without a single alarm being raised? Is justice served when a man is sentenced at 79 years old, decades after the crime? Or does the sentence matter less than the naming, the record, the fact that the truth is now part of the permanent account? And what obligation do departments have to cross-reference the people who have access to their case files, volunteers, contractors, administrative staff, against the evidence in the cases those files describe? Justice found Carol Alderton after 43 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing, no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.